lagi bersama saya Novita di channel Tekon TV. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected with Tekon ID. Seperti yang kita ketahui, penyakit jantung koroner adalah mesin pembunuh nomor 1 di Indonesia. Penyakit ini biasanya disebabkan oleh adanya penumpukan plak di bagian pembuluh darah. Hal itu menyebabkan aliran darah yang menuju ke jantung menjadi terhambat. Lalu sebenarnya apa sih penyebab seseorang bisa menderita penyakit jantung koroner? Bagaimana gejala-gejala yang biasa dialami oleh si penderita? Temukan jawabannya dari penuturan Dr. Lim Tai Tian berikut ini. Tapi sebelumnya, klik tombol subscribe dan nyalakan lonceng notifikasinya agar kamu mendapatkan pemberitahuan seputar video-video menarik dari channel Tekon TV. Follow juga akun Instagram kami di @tekon.id. Dan selamat menyaksikan!
Now, a few observations were done, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, both in China and in Europe. And they saw that people with cardiovascular risk factors, like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, advanced age, had a very high risk of becoming very ill if they caught COVID-19. The other observation which they made is that people with existing heart disease have a much higher mortality when they contract COVID-19. And I will show that in a graph later on. The other thing, what was observed, that some of the patients who caught COVID-19, something happened to their heart. They could either develop a heart attack, or they could get an infection of the heart, what we call a myocarditis, and secondary and weak heart. Now, we all know the symptoms by now, that if you have a fever, a cough, shortness of breath, loss of smell and taste, and diarrhea, there's a high possibility at this point in time that you may have caught COVID-19. Lesser symptoms, though, is chest pain. And what we noticed in the emergency rooms of our hospitals, and this was a learning curve, that patients often came in with breathlessness and chest pain. And we thought this was a heart attack. And later on, we actually found out this was not a heart attack, but a presentation of COVID-19. Meaning, COVID-19 can mimic a heart attack. Even when we do ECGs, we see changes on the ECGs, which can mimic a heart attack. And I think many of us in the world, including Indonesia, took patients to the cath lab to discover they didn't have a heart attack, arteries were open, and then later on when the COVID-19 tests came back, it was positive. And all over the world, actually, cath lab nurses and cardiologists caught COVID-19, and some of them died. But we learned a lot from those early days. As I mentioned, patient with COVID-19 not only can develop shortness of breath, but also chest pain. Shortness of breath and chest pain, however, can also develop when you have a heart attack. Now, another interesting observation is that because so many people get COVID-19 and the hospitals are full, the same as in Indonesia, a lot of patients with shortness of breath and chest pain didn't dare to go to hospitals. Meaning, they had a heart attack. If they went to the hospital, they could have been safe, but they stayed at home. And we notice in all the countries in the world that the rate of mortality secondary to heart attacks went up because they didn't go for treatment. They were afraid that if they went to the hospital, they would catch COVID-19. So what can COVID-19 do to the heart? As I mentioned, like with a flu, people catch a flu. When they don't take care of themselves, the virus can attack the heart. So, for instance, students who get a flu and they say, well, they run it off it's the wrong thing to do because you may make yourself sicker and it can attack the heart. So COVID-19 can attack the heart, cause an inflammation, and eventually get a weak heart. You can present with an acute myocardial infarction because of the stress in existing coronary artery disease. And if the virus attacks the heart, you can also get fast rhythms, meaning not a normal rhythm, but a fast and pathological rhythm, like what you see on television. If let's say a patient in the hospital suddenly gets a cardiac arrest, the doctors and the nurses jump on the patient and try to shock them out of it. And that's often the cause of death. They can present with sudden death. One of the other observations we made that a lot of patients suddenly develop blood clots. Yeah, this could be blood clots in the legs, and you may have seen this on the news where a famous Broadway star lost his leg because of a blood clot in the leg, and unfortunately, he died eventually. Others can get young people. We also made observations that young people suddenly get a stroke because of a blood clot, which is very unusual. The other observations we made is that patients who developed pneumonia because of COVID-19 suddenly deteriorated and died very fast. And with autopsy, they found that there were blood clots in the lungs. Yeah. So one moment, let me go to the next one. Let me talk a little bit about the mortality secondary to COVID-19. Actually, when you're a young person, the mortality is relatively low, 0.3%. But when you get older, over 60 years old, the mortality increases to 6 to 8%. Now, the Italian study showed similar low mortality rates in young people. But in people over 80 years old, the mortality rate was very high, 20%. Now, this is a slide where I want to show the following. The lower line here is the mortality rate. So these are patients without heart disease, but they get and they don't have any damage to the heart, and the mortality rate is very low. Then you have people here with coronary artery disease who get some damage to the heart, and how do we know? Because one of the lab tests called the troponin T is elevated. So the mortality rate is relatively higher at about 10%. Yeah, but people who have an elevated troponin T. Sorry, this curve was people with heart disease and a normal troponin T. These are people without underlying coronary artery disease and an elevated troponin T, meaning damage to the heart, have a relatively high mortality rate of 37%. And people with and coronary artery disease and an elevated troponin T, meaning damage to the heart, have a mortality of about 70%. Yeah. So this graph just shows that if you have underlying heart disease or you have damage to the heart, that is a significant increase in mortality. This is just a graph to show the complexity of what the virus does. So the virus enters the body, usually goes to the airway. It will cause a reaction, an inflammatory reaction. The blood gets stimulated, meaning the blood gets angry. You get blood clots, which goes to the lung. You can get heart attacks. You can get strokes. Yeah, you get stress on the heart, and that secondary again leads to a potential heart attack. So that's about COVID-19 and the heart. I will not talk about treatment of COVID-19 because that's usually done by an infectious disease specialist. But what we cardiologists get involved with patients with COVID-19 because they have heart issues. And what we stand to do now is give blood thinning medications because we know that very ill patients will develop blood clots. Now, let me talk a little bit about coronary artery disease. You know, I looked it up. It is the #1 killer in Indonesia. About 30% of the people in Indonesia die of heart disease. It's fatal in 30%, and 50% of the deaths occur within 1 hour of symptoms. What does that mean? It means it's very important that if you get chest pain, to go to the hospital immediately. And the deaths occur not because of the heart attack, but because, again, you get an arrhythmia, this very fast rhythm. And if you're not in a neighborhood of a hospital and you collapse, you might be saved nowadays because almost every hospital, almost every office building, sport facility, hotel has these automatic defibrillators, which are lifesavers. Even airplanes have these automatic defibrillators where you can shock a patient out of it. Now, this is just a cartoon of the heart, and I just want to show that the major arteries of the heart are on top of the heart. Major arteries with side vessels. So there are 3 major arteries. One to the front of the heart at the left side, one to the back, and one to the right. Yeah. Now, what happens over time is that an artery can the artery can become blocked, and it's a process of years. For instance, this is what you call a plaque, and over years, this can get irritated and grow and completely close off the artery. If it completely closes off the artery, it means a heart attack. If there's a 90% blockage or an 80% blockage, you may get chest pain or shortness of breath. And those are warning signs. Unfortunately, about 20 to 30% of the people may not have any symptoms at all and suddenly drop dead. So the interesting thing about heart disease is it can be prevented, meaning we have risk factors. And I will divide them in modifiable risk factors, meaning you can do something about it, and non-modifiable risk factors. So the non-modifiable risk factors are sex. Males have higher risk, but now studies show that women in the Western world actually also have a high incidence of heart disease, especially post-menopause. And often women don't have symptoms, unlike men. They don't have chest pain. They don't have shortness of breath. I mean, their biggest symptoms is often, I feel tired, yeah? When you get older, you have a higher risk. Race may play a role. For instance, South Asians have a very high risk of coronary artery disease, but many of them also have diabetes. A family history is very important, meaning if your father or your mother had a heart attack at the age of 50, you are at risk. Yeah? If you don't have a if you don't have a family history of heart disease, it doesn't mean you can't get it, but you're in a low risk group. And then you have the modifiable risk factors, meaning conditions which you develop over time or bad habits which you have, which can increase the risk of heart disease. Diabetes mellitus, for instance, can increase the risk of heart disease 4 to 8 times. High blood pressure can increase the risk of heart disease 2 to 3 times. A high cholesterol can increase the heart attack and the risk of heart disease 2 to 3 times. Smoking can increase the risk of heart disease. You know, when you look at people coming in, the young people coming in with a heart attack, or the young people where we put in a stent, and with young people, I mean people in the age range of 35 to 45, almost all of them smoke. Yeah. If you don't do enough exercise, your risk of heart disease. If you're overweight, you're at risk of heart disease. And if you have chronic stress, the observation is you're at risk of heart disease. But it's very difficult to measure stress. Now, this is just a graph to show that when you have a period of, let's say, 10 years, and you want to follow these patients up, who gets a cardiac event over the period of 10 years. So when you have one risk factor, the risk is relatively low, like let's say high blood pressure. If you have 2 risk factors, it already increases. But if you have all the risk factors like high blood pressure, you're a smoker, you've got diabetes, you've got a high cholesterol, high blood pressure, then suddenly the risk goes up to 40%. So this graph is very illustrative that you can say, well, I don't care, and your risk is high, or I do something about it, and you can make your risk much, much lower. So that's why I ask, as a cardiologist, I always ask, what can we do to influence the progression of coronary artery disease? Especially patients who have a strong family history, they come and consult me, and they ask me, what can I do? Because I don't want to end up like my father. So we discuss this, yeah? So can we influence the progression of coronary artery disease? Which risk factors to treat, and how aggressive should we be? lifestyle solutions are regular exercise, diet, and then if we're talking about medication, we should treat cholesterol aggressively, we should treat high blood pressure aggressively, and we should treat diabetes aggressively. Now, these are guidelines by the societies from Europe, United States, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, where we advise moderate exercise, meaning 150 minutes a week, which is basically 30 minutes 5 times a week. This can basically decrease the risk of heart disease. Or you do very intense exercise where you need about 75 minutes a week. Let's talk about a little bit about diet without getting too much involved in it. Let's say the general advice, especially by the American Heart Association and the European Heart Association, is a Mediterranean diet. But let me take out a few points. In the past, we always thought that, and we gave the advice, don't eat too much fat, don't eat animal fat. But when we look at the data analysis of big data, when you look at meat and animal fat, it actually doesn't increase the risk of heart disease or stroke, which is interesting. So you can still have your ribeye with the fat, and there was an observation that if you don't eat too much fat, you have a higher risk, and if you eat a lot of fat, you may have a higher risk. So moderation, that's the answer. What they also saw that if you take a lot of carbohydrates, which turns to sugar, your risk of heart disease increases because rice, noodles, and bread are converted to sugar. And if you have pre-diabetes or diabetes, it increases the risk of heart disease. So saturated fats are not harmful. And in the past, we always thought, well, if you want to drink milk, you should have low-fat milk. You shouldn't take too much cheese. But the analysis showed that actually full milk or cheese is healthy. Red meat in moderate quantities is not associated with heart disease. And being a vegetarian may, in certain people, increase the risk of heart disease because they take more carbohydrates, more rice, more noodles. And this way, they may get pre-diabetes or diabetes, and this increases the risk of heart disease. I just want to make a short remark about ketogenic diet because it's an in word. So ketogenic diet means high fat, moderate amount of protein, and low carbs. But I tried a ketogenic diet myself. After a few weeks, it's not doable, in my opinion. I think you get sick of eating meat every single day. So I believe more in a balanced diet and enjoy life a little bit.
Terima kasih telah menonton video ini. Jangan lupa subscribe channel Tekon TV. Share video ini jika kamu mendapatkan manfaat darinya. Terima kasih.